So thank you all once again for making time to be here in your evening. Or, well, for some of you, maybe it's not quite the same time as others. Some it's the afternoon. And my name is Teresa Blumenstein. So you may have received the invitation to this directly from me or through another member of your congregation. But I am not a member of any congregation. I'm a lay woman, but I have the privilege to get to be the coordinator among a coalition of 19 NGOs that represent Catholic sisters, brothers, priests, and their partners in mission here in New York City at UN headquarters. And that group of 19 NGOs is called the Justice Coalition of Religious, or JCoR for short. And so that is the group that is bringing us all together. And some of you are not new to that information. Some of you have been part of a JCoR delegation or a JCoR meeting somewhere before. So welcome back to old friends. It's great to have you again. And to those that I'm meeting for the first time, so glad to have a chance to get to know you and hear some of your experiences and learn things that that we need to know and bring into the conversation that we have here in New York at the UN. So I would like to, before we dive in any deeper, I'd just like to gather us all in a moment of reflection and prayer. As we get ourselves situated. Gracious God, let our hearts be settled in you today as we celebrate the meeting of our many different paths and callings. Let us rejoice in the opportunity to become better acquainted with new partners and friends from all corners of Zimbabwe and beyond. Let us be awake to your presence within each one. As we learn and plan, let us hold in our hearts our sisters and brothers who are on this day prevented from their usual ministry by the grief of illness or loss. Let us be grateful for this new opportunity to serve you, the source and substance of the mission that unites us and the passion we share. We are humbled to have been entrusted with the service and promotion of justice in our local and global communities. Guide us in our efforts to collaborate and change systems so that we may sow your generous love and light wherever it is needed most. Amen. So since we are a mixed group of close and old friends, some of us, and some of us are new to each other, it seems the right place to begin to try to get to know each other a little bit better. And so with a very nice small group, we'll have the chance to really do some sharing. And so what I'd like to do is invite each of you in turn to introduce yourselves to the group by sharing your name, your congregation, what your connection to Zimbabwe is, if you are born there, if you've lived there your whole life, if you're in ministry there, tell us what your connection is. And then tell us a little bit about the ministry that you're involved in now. And if you are someone who is familiar with the UN Sustainable Development Goals already, then you might like to, as you're introducing your ministry, you might like to say which one or two of those Sustainable Development Goals your ministry the most closely related to. So as we begin to think about putting ourselves in the UN picture as a group. And so if I may, I'll just begin by calling on you each in turn to share and introduce yourselves. But before I do, I'll complete my introduction in the same style that I just described. So as I said already, I'm Teresa Blumenstein. I get to work among many congregations and learn from many charisms. And I have one limited experience of Zimbabwe, going to the Africa Regional Forum for Sustainable Development, which happened last year, just before the pandemic kind of closed all events like that. And that was in Victoria Falls. Got to have a wonderful experience there with some of the people in this group. And the SDG that I would work most closely on is number 17, because most of my work has to do with helping to facilitate collaboration and joint efforts at advocating for human rights and environmental justice. And so I live in this space between trying to connect and join efforts and help strengthen partnerships so that we can make progress toward our common goals. And if I may, I would like to call on Joyce. Joyce, would you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, hello. Oh, thank you. I'm Joyce Rushinga, sister of the religious of the Sacred Heart of Mary. I'm in Mutare. I'm a Zimbabwean, of course. And the development goal that's closer to my ministry is promoting education, and the one that's something to do with the environment. So what else are we talking about?
And what is your connection to Zimbabwe?
Oh, connection to Zimbabwe. I'm a Zimbabwean here.
Have you lived there your whole life?
Oh, yes.
You're a true expert. Very good. And we'll say, so the environmental SDGs are 13 is climate action, 14 has to do with oceans, health of oceans, and 15 has to do with the diversity of species on land. So somewhere in there maybe is your work.
JCoR.
Okay, thank you, Joyce. And Joaquin, Father Joaquin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Joaquin, I hope you can hear me properly.
Yes, we can.
This is Joaquin Bejar. I am based in Rua. I belong to a congregation called Claritian Missionaries. I am here in Zimbabwe since 2006. And my main ministry is in a parish here in Rua. And we have also 2 schools, 1 primary and secondary school. So among the SDGs is number 4, like Sister Joyce, quality education, and also number 1, the issue of eradication of poverty. Thank you.
Thank you, Joaquin. And Father, I'm sorry, is it Fortune or is it Fortune?
It's Fortune, it's Brother Fortune.
Okay, Brother Fortune, please introduce yourself.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Brother Fortune Chakasara. I'm a married brother, and I work closely with our NGO, Foundation for Marriage International Solidarity, that does child rights advocacy, and that's my ministry that I deal with from child safeguarding, child rights, and protection of vulnerable adults. So I do a lot of workshops in this area. I do a lot of training, and also have been involved with the UPR of countries in our province. And my connection to Zimbabwe is I'm Zimbabwean, but currently I normally tell people I work from Cape Town, but covering the province, and I'm most of the times doing this work of child rights and safeguarding in Zimbabwe. I just came back on Friday. I was in Zimbabwe last week. And I've been here in Cape Town since 2016, doing the same ministry. I'm also in leadership as well. Yeah, my SDG that, as you can see, most of these, they cover children as well. So a good number of them will be of my greater interest, but specifically 3, 4, and 5, talking of good health and well-being, but mostly focusing on children. And the 4th one, quality education as well, and gender equality, but mostly giving the attention to children. Thank you.
Thank you. Great to meet you. I live with someone who works very closely with the Marist brothers in New York. So she was very excited. I was finally meeting a Marist brother in one of my meetings today. Veronica, would you like to go next?
Okay, I am Sister Veronica Brand. I'm religious at the Sacred Heart of Mary, and my present ministry is representing our congregation here at the UN in New York, and that's where I am right now. Yeah, we're two of us are sharing. Grace and I share an office, so she's closing the door so we don't disturb one another as we speak. So I have been here since 2013, but I am a Zimbabwean, even though I lost my passport. I grew up in Zimbabwe, and I have been a Zimbabwean all my life until I couldn't renew it. And I was in Zimbabwe teaching at the School of Social Work. Some of you may have remembered that from Harare. And then later on in Zambia. And it's nice to see Anne McDermott there, because we knew each other from our times in Zambia. So the SDGs, we are involved with many of them, all of them, certainly 4, as Joyce has mentioned, certainly the environmental ones. And I'd like to add SDG 5 as well, because our focus on women and children. So, but every one of them is relevant and interconnected. So it's very hard to say which one. The last time I was in Zimbabwe was January 2018, when I was there for our 2019, when I was there for our regional chapter. Thank you.
Thanks, Veronica. Father Mlilo.
Yes, thank you. I hope you can hear me. Okay. I'm Father Mlilo from Zimbabwe. I'm a Zimbabwean, an oblate of Mary Immaculate, working currently in a parish. But my ministry, part of my ministry, I'm working for Justice and Peace. I'm representing Justice and Peace in Zimbabwe for the oblates of Mary Immaculate. The SDG, that is a bit closer to what I'm doing. They're interrelated. I can see the number 13, climate action, and also number 16. I'm mostly focusing on Laudato-Si. When I'm doing my workshops around, I'm focusing on Laudato-Si, one of the encyclicals of Thank you.
Thank you. Sister Sarudzai.
Thank you. Greetings to everyone. Sister Sarudzai, I'm a Dominican sister, born Zimbabwean, and I grew up in Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, I'm an educator, and I work at a girls' school. So some of the SDGs that I involve myself in is quality education, gender equality, and issues on the climate. We plant trees. And one of the things that I'm doing, I'm also a promoter for justice and peace in the Southern Zone, representing the Dominican Sisters Africa, which is a branch of the Dominican Sisters International. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Saru. And Father Pamidzai.
Yes, good evening.
Now I see your name, so I can call on you. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Father Pamidzai Mutsuta, belonging to the Oblate of Mary Immaculate, and I'm a Zimbabwean. Presently, I'm working at St. Luke's Mission, Lupane, near way to Big Falls, Victoria Falls. It's about 120 kilometers from Bulawayo, the city of Bulawayo. So what I'm doing there, I'm the parish priest there, the mission. And also we have two schools, School of Nursing and School of Midwifery, where they train the general nurses and then the midwives there. And also we work with the communities out there. We reach out to different communities. And it's my first time to join this meeting. And I'm still also into learning and also seeing what is this all about. I'm also interested with taking care of the environment and also the issues of justice. But mainly they were mostly attached to the hospital, also as the chaplain, and also the education there and the mission. So that's what I can say. Thank you.
Great, thank you and welcome, Father. And let's see, looks like we lost Sister Anatolia. Hopefully she returns, probably an internet issue. Grace, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I have to unmute. Hello, everybody. Hello from New York. My name is Grace Amarachi Zonu. I am from Nigeria, but we have sisters. We've had sisters in Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, old Rhodesia, for about over a century. We still have sisters there. So I have a connection to Zimbabwe, of course, as an African. I represent Sisters of Notre Dame de Namio at the United Nations. So it's really difficult because the SDGs are so interrelated, you can't talk about one without the other. So I always find this very difficult. I have my arms and my legs on every one of them. But as a sister of Notre Dame, education is at the heart of our ministry, our charism.
Thanks, Grace. And Father Brian?
Thank you for the promotion. I'm not,
please correct me.
I'm a bishop. No, I'm not that either. I'm lay. I work for the Presentation Sisters in Ireland and England, and my job in Ireland and England is working at justice, peace, and the integrity of creation, and that's my role with regards to the in Ireland and England. But I have another role as part of the International Presentation Association, where we have ECOSOC status at the United Nations. So from the very beginning, we've been involved in the SDGs. And in Ireland, we've had a hand in shaping civil society and how they can be involved. And we've levered our way into being involved, which was handy because we learned how to do it when we needed to do it in the United Kingdom then the year after. And I was lucky enough to be able to attend the United Nations when the UK were presenting their VNR last year or 2 years ago. And we have a presentation presence in about 20 to 21 countries. So we keep an eye on when every single one of those is up for VNR or UPO or anything like that. And one of our main reasons for doing that is sometimes civil society doesn't have a strong hand in some countries because they're not allowed. However, I might have more of an influence here in Dublin than somebody living in the country where they cannot have the influence. So by virtue of being part of a wide family, we have our hands all over everybody's SDGs and everybody's VNRs and everybody's spotlight report or even shadow VNR. But if you were to ask which SDGs we're closely aligned to, in my work in Ireland and England, we will be very involved in Laudato Si, Fratelli Tutti and the environmental SDGs. But we would also be involved through a work at the UN in the SDGs 4 and 5, 5.2, 8.7, around human trafficking, modern slavery, particularly in the United Kingdom where it's a big problem. We would look at any of them that involve people. So as others have said, we're involved in them all. But one thing that we do hold firm is that, and it's an Irish thing, I think, very much an Irish thing, which is why I'm here tonight, is because the SDGs are not achieved anywhere until they're achieved everywhere, and everywhere else first, because we are further ahead. And I think the question we have is not why are so many so far behind, it's a question of why are so many so far ahead. So, and my link to Zimbabwe is, I have never been there, but I've heard through Anne McDermott and I've heard through Anatolia, so I know a little bit about it. And someday, please God, I will get there and I will meet some of the people on this call. So that's my few pence worth. And thanks very much, Sister Teresa.
There, now we're even. We've promoted each other. And you do have a lot of experience with the VNRs and the HLPF, so I'm gonna have you do the rest of the presentation, if you don't mind. Because you must know it all inside out. And I see Anatolia is back with us. Lovely. So Anatolia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you. Greetings to everyone. I am Sister Anatolia, Presentation Sisters, also known in the UN as the International Presentation Association. I am the Justice Contact for Zambia and Zimbabwe, and currently I'm in Marondera. And the SDGs, which are closer to me right now, as the International Presentation Association, we are working on the elimination of violence against women and children. That's SDG number 5, gender equality. And also, we are working towards the realizing and respecting the rights of the earth. We live in communion with all of creation. So we plant trees, we work for justice for creation, and also we look into the issues to do with climate change. And currently I'm working on a paper which I'm writing on the effects of climate change on women in subsistence farming in rural Zimbabwe. Thank you.
Excellent. I'd like to read that when you're finished. That sounds very interesting and something that we should bring to a conversation happening at some UN conference sooner or later. So keep us informed on that one, Sister Anatolia. Okay. And finally, last but not least, Sister Anne. Oh, and I'll read the chat box. I know you've typed. Okay, so Sister Anne says she's a presentation sister now in the Ministry of Leadership in Monastereven. And she's the link on her central leadership team with the coordinating team for justice. She has lived for years in Zambia, but now the sisters in Zambia and Zimbabwe have become one unit. So the SDGs that get her attention are around women and the environment. So that would be number 5, and that cluster that always seem to come together, 13, 14, 15. Thank you, Sister Anne, and very nice to meet you and hope to hear your voice one day. Okay, so now we are all a bit more familiar. So I will get us going into a little bit of input now, and with apologies to those who may find some of this familiar. I never managed to give a presentation the same way twice, so hopefully there will be at least some variety for you if you know some parts from an earlier conversation. But I like to begin any conversation with any group of people who are coming into UN advocacy by talking about why it is that religious congregations have a presence in the UN system, which on its face seems to be a very secular space, a very political space, and in at least many countries of the world, there's a very serious separation between matters of the state and the government and matters of faith and religion. And so why is it that they should be mingled in a space like the United Nations? And what is the value that we can add to a space like the UN as religious? And also, what purpose does the UN serve in terms of our mission and our goals and our charisms? So I will continue with some slides. Oh, sorry. I do apologize if you're hearing my background music of a car alarm that has been going on all day. You're getting a little taste of New York City. So that's how my entire morning has been. So a good place to begin with this conversation is talking about why religious are at the United Nations and why they bring special value to the United Nations. So within the UN system, religious congregations are thrown into the larger category of non-governmental organizations, or NGOs. And there are over 5,000 NGOs that have an accreditation with the UN system through this piece that's labeled as a green bubble over here, called the Economic and Social Council. And that's what affords us an opportunity to participate in certain UN proceedings and conferences, and to have some voice in the process and the conversation. And there are about 30 NGOs in this group of 5,000 that are representing Catholic congregations of women and men religious. And many of those are coalitions in and of themselves. So this group of 30 NGOs actually is representing a community of over 200 individual congregations. And once an NGO is accredited, we're able to participate in UN proceedings in a variety of ways. We can make oral statements in certain conferences. We are able to submit written statements with our recommendations for a given process or discussion. We can set up meetings with diplomats who are representing governments. We can participate in UN conferences that happen routinely from year to year, or new ones that are always arising for the first time as the world learns and new issues come to the center of our focus. We can also sponsor events inside and near UN headquarters that help bring forward our voices and the issues of our concern. And we can also make formal and informal recommendations whenever there is a new UN agreement or a document of some kind being negotiated. There will often be some kind of invitation for civil society or the non-government community to have some input into the language that will be included in that document. We are also take an important role in conversations where we are assessing nations' progress, either towards certain human rights frameworks or documents that have been agreed to through the UN system. And sometimes our role in that case is actually to submit reports on the progress that has not been made by governments, because those who are outside of government are often in a better position to see where the gaps are, where the flaws are in actually delivering on the promises of human rights. And there's a very particular quality that religious congregations bring to the conversation happening at the UN. One of the aspects of this quality is that the voice is known to be credible, because congregations are providing insights from your work, ministering to those who are suffering the most from poverty, or those who are the most marginalized and have been made vulnerable. You bring firsthand experience and firsthand insight to the conversation. Because you stretch across borders and exist as institutions that span many countries, you also have an impartiality to your voice, because you are representing communities that don't have a particular bias or affiliation with a particular government or national identity. Your voice as religious congregations is also known to be especially rooted in your morals and values, of course, because you're known for your deep personal and communal dedication to care for human dignity and care for the natural environment, and the very many other Catholic social teaching principles that we can also find within very many UN documents. And the religious voice is also known to bring a steadiness and a stability to UN conversations, because many of the religious congregations who are present at the UN have actually had constitutions, and they have existed as institutions longer than the UN itself, and in some cases longer than the actual countries, the member states who are represented there. And unlike the way that government leadership can shift from one year to another, and maybe the political positions that government is taking kind of shift with that change in leadership, we see much more steadiness and consistency in the positions that are being taken by religious congregations who have values-based constitutions that allow for a steady movement, a steady hand at the wheel from year to year and generation to generation. And I think it's always important when having this conversation to say not only what the religious congregations offer to the UN system, but also to recognize that the UN system has very strong echoes and very strong support for the mission and the prophetic call that is shared among members of religious congregations. And one very clear place that we can look to see that endorsement of your mission is within the UN Charter, which is essentially the constitution of the UN as an institution. And it begins very importantly with the phrase, "We the peoples," which states in the very first words ever written about or for or governing the UN, states that contrary to what we often think, this institution is not a union of governments, but in fact, it is a union of peoples. And so the governments may be there as a stand-in, but really their role is to represent the peoples of the world. And that's who owns the United Nations as a system, and that's whose voices are meant to be part of the conversation and the decision-making process. So the charter begins, "We, the peoples of the United Nations, are determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, reaffirm faith in the dignity and worth of the human person, uphold equal rights of men and women, the equal rights of both large and small nations, to establish justice and respect, to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. And toward these ends, the UN aims to practice tolerance that allows us to live together in peace as good neighbors. It calls on us to maintain peace, to be peacemakers. It calls upon the peoples of the world to promote the economic and social advancement of all peoples. Whenever I read this document, I am struck by the ways in which it very clearly echoes a lot of the language that we see in our own social teaching from the Catholic tradition. And I imagine you also hear echoes to many of your constitutions. So there is a strong mutual reinforcement here between the missions of our congregations and the mission of the United Nations. And it has also been said, and I quite agree, that if we look closely at the Sustainable Development Goals, they're really painting a picture of what we might in our own tradition describe as the reign of God, if someone were to ask us what it looked like. There would not be poverty. We would live without hunger. Everyone would have good health and be cared for. Everyone would have a chance for quality education. Men and women would experience equity. Boys and girls, equity. There would be no illness having to do with unclean water or lack of sanitation. We would have affordable and clean energy, decent work. We'd have opportunities for creation and innovation. It's in our nature as creature creators. We wouldn't live with the gross inequalities that we see around us in every facet of life. The communities that we build as cities would be sustainable and harmonious with the environment around us. We wouldn't consume more than we needed, and therefore we wouldn't produce more than we needed, take more from the earth than we need to. We would be conscientious of the pollution that we're putting out in the form of carbon dioxide. We would care for all species and try to promote their diversity, whether they be dwellers of water or land. And we would want institutions governing us that allowed for peace among us, that allowed all people's access to justice. And of course, we would have partnerships so that each one could bring their gifts to the shared body. So while the language might be a bit different, we can see perhaps here a secular roadmap to the reign of God. And if that's not enough endorsement, we have some pretty direct statements of support and desire for the influence of spiritual leadership from within the UN system, from within UN leadership. It was the former UN Deputy Secretary General, Jan Eliasson, who said, it's important to realize that there is an element of spirituality needed in what we do if we are to stop the trend of dividing humanity to us and them, and to realize that the most important word in the world is together. The very long-term, very slow form of work to change global realities. That requires a fortitude and a patience that has to come from spiritual sources to be carried out beyond lifetimes and across generations. We also have the warm words of Dr. Aza Karam, who was a senior advisor to the UN Population Fund and a theologian herself in the Muslim tradition, who wrote that the United Nations and its agencies deal with a wide range of issues like human rights, population, food, agriculture, health, trade, and children. And for each of these issues, religion plays a powerful, complementary, moral, social, economic, and political role for those communities who have been disenfranchised or left behind. Every religious tradition has leaders and networks that provide food distribution, healthcare, education, conflict mediation, many of the things that you all were mentioning when you were describing your ministries. And she acknowledges in her role at the UN that religious social service networks preceded the UN and government entities, and they reach more people and are more deeply entrenched in the community than any other type of organization. There's a strong endorsement and a strong acknowledgement there from within the UN system for the vital role of the spiritual voice and spiritual leadership in the UN conversation. And we also have an endorsement from the side of spiritual leadership, of course, in Pope Francis, who in a speech that he gave to a community of business leaders several years ago, named that politics, though it often doesn't have the best of reputations in terms of high moral ground, is actually one of the highest forms of charity, so long as it seeks the common good. And so he encouraged all those who were gathered to be courageous and to enter into political, economic projects, allowing themselves to be influenced by a broader meaning of life that would allow them to truly serve the common good and to truly increase the goods of this world and make them more accessible to all. And going even further back, a voice from deeper into our history, a quotation that actually appears in the Catechism of our church from St. John Chrysostom, reminds us that as people of faith, we're not only called to counteract unjust politics and economics through charitable works, but we're also called to transform the unjust systems that create inequalities, that create poverty, so that we can eradicate the suffering that demands our charity. And as St. John says, not to enable the poor to share in our goods is to steal from them and deprive them of life. That which is already due in justice is not to be offered as a gift of charity. So to sum it all up, in the words of Pope Francis again, the spiritual is integral to all dimensions of our development. We're faced not with separate crises, one environmental, another social, another economic, but with one complex crisis, which is all. As we were saying, when trying to align ourselves with one or two SDGs, it's difficult to do because the problems are united, they're connected, the crisis is united. And so the work and the solution must be united. And it has to happen everywhere for it to really succeed anywhere. And so as Pope Francis says, the strategies for a solution demand an integral approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity, and at the same time, protecting nature. So I'll pause there for a moment and just ask, I know many of you are already experts in this field, so it might not be a moment for questions so much as comments or additional lessons you might like to offer to the group. But I just want to pause and offer a moment if anyone would like to ask anything or to add anything. The floor is open to you. Okay, You're an easy crowd. You weather the many minutes of my speaking very patiently. Well, in that case, I will go ahead to move on to speak more specifically about the particular conference that brings us all together at this moment, which we'll get into a little bit more of the hard details of the way that this particular UN process is organized. And again, I hope that my background music isn't too obvious or overwhelming my voice. So now we'll get a little bit into where all of these ideas meet. We're going to talk about Zimbabwe, the place that connects us all. We're going to talk about how we can operate to create change as Catholic religious, and how we can do it in this space that is fondly known as the HLPF, or High Level Political Forum for Sustainable Development. So to begin at the beginning, the High Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development is the primary conference within the UN system that allows for us to review nation by nation the progress that we're making toward achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And this conference, apart from pandemic circumstances, is usually held every year in July in New York at UN headquarters. And of course, last year and this year, it's being held essentially virtually for the sake of public health. And the central components to this forum involve governments on a voluntary basis presenting their own reflections, their own reports on the progress that they're making as a nation toward achievement of the SDGs. And these reports they submit are known as voluntary national reviews, which, because we use an abbreviation for everything in the UN system, are fondly known as VNRs. And a very important secondary component to this conversation is that civil society groups like ourselves are called to complete the storytelling that is begun by the government reports in the VNRs. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, our role as civil society is very often to add additional perspective, complementary perspective, to fill out the report, the story that's being offered by government, to give a more complete picture of the progress that nations are or are not making toward the SDGs. And at the end of each forum, the outcome, the concrete outcome that we can expect is that the governments will produce jointly a declaration of their own observations on global trends of progress or lack thereof toward the SDGs. And they'll also state some of their global intentions for how we can accelerate that progress and improve our work toward the SDGs. And this outcome document is known as the Ministerial Declaration. So this year, as you may know, the HLPF will be taking place from the 6th to the 15th of July. And it has a theme every year that involves a handful of the full list of SDGs. And this year it is a particularly large handful. It's easier to say which ones are not included than which ones are. But the theme for this year is recovery, sustainable recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, and relating that recovery specifically to SDG 1, eradication of poverty, SDG 2, zero hunger, SDG 3, good health and well-being, SDG 8, decent work and employment, SDG 10, reduced inequalities, SDG 12, responsible production and consumption, SDG 13, climate action, SDG 16, good governance, and SDG 17, partnerships. And the governments who will be presenting their VNRs this year at the HLPF are a large number. 42 will be presenting, and among that large number are 8 African nations. And of course, one of those is Zimbabwe. And so that is why we have come together as a group this year at this moment to seize the opportunity of following the report that the government of Zimbabwe will be submitting, to learn from our fellow members of civil society who are also submitting their perspectives and their reports on SDG progress, and to better understand how we can engage with this long process that has begun probably from October of last year onward in preparation for this week and a half of meeting in July. And a few things that are important to understand about the voluntary national reviews is that they do not offer enough time or space to give a comprehensive picture of the reality in any country. And for that reason, the governments presenting them typically tend to focus almost exclusively on positive news or the strengths that they have exhibited in the last year or few years in their work toward the SDGs. And of course, that means that they leave gaps in the story, especially related to how those communities who are the most socially or economically excluded are faring, how the SDG progress is not quite reaching every community. And so that's where we come in as civil society. Our role is to observe those gaps and then to fill them by offering our perspectives as a complement to the story that's being told by the governments, and to help the global community better understand the whole picture. It's also our role in this way to be holding governments accountable for the delivery of all the SDGs, because as we said, none of them can really come to fruition unless they all do, and also needs to come to fruition for all communities. If we're leaving anyone out of the discussion or out of the progress, then we've not truly achieved the goal. And finally, it's our role to offer our own insights as practitioners who have been in the middle of some of the most challenging circumstances in trying to deliver sustainable development to communities in its very many aspects. We have experiences and stories and insights to share such that we can recommend good policies or practices that might be helpful and might guide governments toward better delivery and more rapid delivery of the SDGs. And in Zimbabwe, there are 2 very strong networks of NGOs who help to coordinate the larger community around offering reports as a complement to the government's VNRs. And there are more than 2, but these are surely the 2 most prominent. And so if you start to familiarize yourself with them, follow the information that they are always putting out by email or on social media, then you will find soon that you are up to date on the larger community of SDG networks who are monitoring progress and who are preparing almost year-round to participate in the HLPF. And these 2 civil society networks are the CSO, meaning Civil Society Organization, SDG Reference Group, and the National Association of NGOs for Zimbabwe. And I've just included some contact information there for those who are interested, who might like to be more connected with those groups and to learn when they're meeting and what they're talking about. Those who are directing those groups are very open and accessible, and ready to bring in more groups, more organizations, more partnership for more insight. And Judith Collum, you'll see there, she is the executive director of an organization called the Poverty Reduction Forum Trust. And she has given very many talks to the larger community of NGOs to help get more of us involved in this SDG monitoring process. And the same goes for the director, Leonard Mandishara, who directs NANGO. So I'll pause there, because that was quite a bit of hard factual information at once. So I just want to take another moment to breathe and ask if there's anything anyone would like to ask or to add to the topics that I was just covering.
Teresa, can I add that in the VNRs, I think every country undertaking a VNR presentation has to make some comment on the principle of leaving no one behind. And I think they also have to make some comment on children in their presentation. And I think too, this year, I think there's something about having to mention somewhere how they will build back better and reference to the decade of action, because these are just kind of things that are coming up now, I think. So I think they have to be referenced somewhere in it. So that's my little piece. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. Yes, the UN is very big on adding kind of special names to years and special names to decades. That's meant to get us excited and garner a lot of energy and momentum behind a specific cause. So if you hear the phrase, the decade of action, that kind of follows on from this idea that the 2030 agenda was essentially a 15-year agenda because it began in 2015. And the first 5 years of that 15-year agenda were kind of the transition, the building momentum and getting up to speed and learning what our baseline realities are, where we're starting from as individual countries. And so the idea is now, as we have turned into the second set of 5 years, that this is no longer the time for planning or getting our bearings or learning how to act, but now is the time to move. And so that's where we are seeing this phrase, the decade for action, is now through 2030 when these goals are meant to be achieved. Any other questions or comments to add? Sure, Veronica, you're muted.
I have a question for the participants in the country. I would be very interested in knowing whether you are in contact with either of the two organizations, NANGO or CSO, one that's focusing especially on the NDGs, or do you have personal contacts with any of them? I would be very interested to know, because I know they are umbrella groups. There are many other groups, but that could be helpful to all of us to know, I think. I mean, I knew someone who used to be the director of NANGO, but that's a long time ago. And unfortunately, I don't think he's still involved, but I'm just wondering if any of the rest of you on the ground are familiar with or know the people. Mm-hmm. Okay, just if you do, it would be helpful information, I think, to share. I mean, Judith Collum, we did meet when Zimbabwe presented their report for the first time 3 years ago. Teresa, can I just share one little memory from that? And Zimbabwe is the only country who has presented so far who had a very dramatic occurrence after they presented the report that led to every member state, every civil society having to exit the building because there was an alarm. And unfortunately, there was no time to have one civil society follow up afterwards. It had to be abbreviated because they had lost time. So Zimbabwe has unfortunately lost a very precious moment of feedback on their VNR. So hopefully that will not happen this time.
Any comments or questions before we move on to another piece? Okay. So just to get into a little bit more detail then about what work has already been done in terms of Zimbabwe and participation in the HLPF, since we're now a few iterations in. We've had this conference a few times now. So as Veronica was just saying, Zimbabwe has submitted a report. This will be the second time that they're submitting a VNR. First time was in the year 2017. And I have here for you to review later, if you'd like, the summary and the full report that they submitted. Summary is extremely short and the full report is extremely long. So if you do dive into the full report, I would say, unless you want to make a PhD experience out of it, I would suggest kind of looking to focus on specific SDGs, perhaps the ones you mentioned as you were introducing yourselves, that are most closely related to your ministry and on which you will have the most insight and the most capacity to respond. And that way you don't need to have your life overtaken by trying to read through a couple hundred pages of Zimbabwe's development progress. Though if you are interested in that, I say more power to you, that's wonderful. And we definitely need you in this kind of work if that's what you like to do. And another important thing to note is that there is a point person, a contact person within the government of Zimbabwe for any matters, any issues having to do with the SDGs, and that is Mr. Moyo in the Department of Environment and Tourism. And just to give an overview of what's coming up with this year's report from the government, at this point, they've submitted what they call main messages, which is sort of like a summary, a very, very slimmed down concept of what key points are that they wanted to make in their full VNR report. And so I have divided here, there were, I think it was 8 or 9 points in the set of main messages that the government submitted already. And they will submit their much lengthier report closer to, oh, go ahead, Veronica.
It's out as of this morning, I think. I have it.
Oh, okay, good. Okay,
144 pages. So I think they must have just put it up today.
Okay, good. Well, we'll follow up with that then. I will add a link to it. Thank you, Veronica, for the update, hot off the presses. But to get a very, very extreme summary of what you can expect to find in that 144 pages, there are a few points that they make that are kind of reflecting on progress that they believe they've made, and also some promises and some commitments and some strategies that they're looking to employ in the years ahead to help move toward the SDGs. And so in the category of looking backward, the government reported that violence in all forms has declined due to public awareness about exploitation, heightened policing, crime prevention and peace committees, and new laws that are protecting human rights. And I should say, as I'm reading this, you can begin your reflection exercise that we'll do a lot of discussing next time. Begin asking yourselves, Where do you see this rhetoric, these reports aligning with your own experience, and where do you see it's conflicting with your experience, and what pieces are missing altogether? Another message that was offered by the government for their report this year was that agricultural yields are increasing and production has become more environmentally sustainable. The practices that they're employing are now more environmentally sustainable. They also report that maternal and child mortality and HIV infection and transmission rates are declining, and they attribute that to healthcare coverage and quality improving. They've also reported that gender equality measures have been written into most national laws, and as a result, they're seeing improvement in women's political participation, decision-making power, and economic security or financial resources. And the points that they offer looking forward to their strategy for continuing to make progress, they place a very strong emphasis on the way that they have integrated the 2030 agenda across all government plans and strategies that have to do with social and economic development. There are a great many documents about how the SDGs are woven across the different ministries and institutions of government. They also expect that they'll have new financial resources to help fund their work toward the SDGs and other development projects, because they're expecting a heightened response to corruption or finance-related crimes that will help stop some of the loss of funds that disappears through illegal channels, through corruption. They also expect that more partnerships between government and private business and remittances from those who have started in Zimbabwe and moved abroad and are sending money home will both be significant sources of income that will help fund work toward the SDGs. And they're also expecting that they will employ a shift in the way that they conduct diplomacy with other governments, and they're shifting toward a tactic that is based more on financial incentives and sanctions than previously employed tactics, and they believe that this will boost the investments that foreign governments are interested in making in Zimbabwe, that it will increase international trade, and that will improve rates of unemployment, rates of informal employment, and help stop the trend of wages declining. So a lot of very positive statements, a very happy outlook. It sounds from these main messages that things are essentially all going in positive directions, and if there's something that they don't yet have tangible progress to report, they've offered some potential tactics that they might employ to start seeing some of that improvement in the couple of years ahead, before they'll probably look to be submitting their next VNR a couple of years from now, if they keep to this trend of every few years. And of course, to offer a complement to that report, we have seen over several years the reports being submitted also by the civil society networks in Zimbabwe. So again, the CSO reference group on the SDGs, and in this case, another network that exists on a global level, which is known as the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, who recently came out with a very lengthy, impressive, data-rich report that offers specific profiles on every country that is part of the United Nations, and offers very colorful, concrete data that you can go in. They have a nice digital tool if you're someone who likes graphs and data and visuals and infographics. you can go in and play around and kind of see the hard numbers that are available to get a better, clearer, more mathematical sense of the progress that your country is making. So I have links here to a set of reports. First, there are 2 reports from the year of the government's original report, 2017, in which the CSOs submitted both a report ahead of the HLPF, and then they also met a couple of months after the HLPF to kind of share their feedback and debrief the experience and say how they thought it went and how the government's report compared to theirs. And so then they issued a second report summarizing the conversations from that meeting. So I have links to both of those there if you are inclined to dig into either of those to learn what your fellow members of civil society are saying. Then there's also a report that civil society submitted as a complement to an interesting interim style report that Zimbabwe created, which is sort of a more abbreviated annual update on their progress. And so civil society was following right along and also submitted a report to complement that annual update. So here I've included the annual report that was submitted by CSOs in 2019. And finally, then there are 2 reports for this year. And right now it's, as far as I know, maybe Veronica can correct me again, I have not seen a final version of a CSO report yet for this year.
No, I haven't either.
Okay.
I haven't.
Good. So I'm not missing that one yet. But there are recordings available to the consultations that were held among the CSOs to help bring their voices together and present one united statement as a group, as a national network. And so you can get a pretty strong sense of what the big picture is. And they brought their many voices together through a process that you might be familiar with called creating a scorecard. So essentially many organizations were invited to rank on a scale of 1 to 5 how they would rate the country on a long list of characteristics that had to do with each of the 17 SDGs. And then they took all of those numbers and all of that input and assessed the average response and used that to score the country in all of these many areas. And that became kind of the core of the civil society report that's being submitted. And so I have a link there to what's at least the preliminary results from that scorecard process. And I've took a look at the clock. It's a 4-hour consultation, but the meat of it, the central part that summarizes the results of that joint process of creating a score, actually only goes for about 1 hour and 10 minutes and offers a pretty clear, pretty useful and interesting presentation on how CSOs are viewing Zimbabwe's progress by this time. So if you're someone who enjoys video or listening as your way of learning, more so than reading a report or playing with some digital data tools, then that might be the way that you would choose to go forward in kind of assessing and reflecting on civil society's input to this process. But if you are someone who really likes the digital data tools, then you might be drawn to the second or the final report that's listed here, which is the country profile for Zimbabwe. It's part of this much larger global report. That's the 2021 Sustainable Development Report, both vague but a very appropriate name. And I'm actually going to, since we have some time, I'm going to pull that up for you because it's really pretty attractive and interesting as a tool. So this is the main screen when you find your way to the Sustainable Development Report. And you can see we're in the profile that's for Zimbabwe specifically. And they have a few different types of indices here that are kind of these big numbers that were created from many smaller scores having to do with each of the SDGs. And that's essentially done through a process somewhat similar to the process I was describing about the scorecard, except this one is less about opinions and ranking of people who are giving input, and it's more about very specific targets and pieces of data that were agreed upon when the SDGs were adopted. There was a set of indicators that all the governments agreed to, saying, okay, this is how we'll measure whether or not we've really achieved this goal. And so it's those same indicators and those same data pieces, data points that are included in these big picture scores here. And then they rank the countries against one another with using these two indices in order to create this number. Or sorry, they rank this number to create this number. So you can see here that overall in the very, very big picture with no detail, they've put Zimbabwe as 125th out of 165 countries that were included in the report. And if you scroll down, you'll see that they offer assessments on each of the SDGs individually. You'll notice the colors here are not the colors that you're used to seeing each of these tiles in, because the color of the square itself is indicating whether or not at this moment the SDG is considered to have been achieved, or if that's, so if you see it as green, it's something that is considered to have been achieved. So at this moment, this report considers both Goal 12 and Goal 13 to be achieved and on track for Zimbabwe. If you see it in yellow, then the writers of the report are indicating that some challenges still remain toward achieving the goal. The deeper orange color means significant challenges remain. The red means major challenges remain. And if you see something almost invisible in very light gray, that's because there simply wasn't enough data available to assess how far or how close the country is to achieving that SDG. You also see arrows next to almost all of these tiles, and the arrows are also telling us something slightly different. What they're saying is kind of what is the trajectory. You know, we're not necessarily achieving the SDG yet, but are we on pace? Are we making progress fast enough that we can expect to achieve it by the year 2030? And so if you see a green arrow, then that means that the country is on track to meet the goal by 2030. Again, if you see a yellow arrow, that means that you're picking up speed toward achieving it. You're headed in the right direction and getting closer to being on track. If you see an orange arrow that's going laterally, that means that progress has essentially stalled or stagnated. And so right now, not really getting any closer to the goal. Or if you see the red arrow pointing down, that means you're actually losing ground, getting further away from achieving the goal. And again, if you see pale gray dots, that means that the data is not available. And so a few very important points to note in this big picture look at Zimbabwe are that we don't have data for a goal that's very important and dear to many of us, which is SDG number 1, eradicating poverty. And that they don't have data either for the present situation or whether or not we're on track. And we also don't have data for SDG 14. And my understanding is that the primary reason for that, and this is true in many landlocked countries, is that the governments have elected essentially not to engage with that SDG because they don't consider it applicable to them because they do not have any territory that touches an ocean. And that goal has to do specifically with good management of oceans. However, there is a movement within the UN system trying to encourage all governments to engage with this SDG because, of course, anyone who has seen those very saddening photos of the trash islands that are floating around in the ocean know that what you find in the ocean did not begin in the ocean. And so even those who are not necessarily touching an ocean, those who may be at some distance from it, still have an impact on the ocean. We all have an impact on the ocean, and we're all dependent on the ocean as a stabilizing force for our climate, as a major source of food, a major source of oxygen and an absorber of carbon dioxide. It is a powerful and important force, no matter how close or far you might be from it. So that's just something important to note for Zimbabwe. That right now, there's not a lot of energy coming from the government to even assess progress toward that goal. They've kind of crossed it off the list and are leaving it alone. And again, you'll also see that right now it's considered that the country is making pretty good progress and is well on track for goals 12 and 13, which is good for those of you who have stated that you're dedicated toward environmental work and projects. However, again, we have no effort whatsoever toward life below water. And we still see that there is some significant challenges remaining for SDG 15, life on land, and actually the red arrow again reminding us that we're actually seeing a decline, a movement away from achieving the goal. We're losing ground on that. And the same goes for goal 11, sustainability of cities and communities. And this is, again, just the very big picture. You could really spend hours with this tool. Just as a very quick example, if you click to open any one of these SDGs, you will see the side column here will open, and you'll get a great deal more detail about the specific indicators that contribute to the overall score, the overall determination of red or green or yellow or orange, and which arrow. You can find it all here under the list of indicators. And you can even dig one level deeper if you want to, for example, learn more about stunting in children under 5 years of age. You can click on that, and you can actually get specific scoring and numbers and details, and you can even see, you can get a description of how that piece of data is measured, what it means, and get a better sense of how far or close Zimbabwe is to the ideal score right now. You can get a sense of how it's moving over time by looking at a graph. And you can also find the source of the data here. They have a link to whoever provided that data point. And that's available under each of these SDGs. It has a whole set of indicators, and then within the indicators is all of that information about how it is being measured. So a tremendous, tremendous amount of information is included within this tool. And this is really only one section of the overall report. There's something up here called the Data Explorer that offers really interesting dynamic graphs. If this is something you're into, you can compare countries against each other on any data point that's included somewhere in the indicators of the 2030 agenda. There are interactive maps that can allow you to, in various shades of a color, get a sense. So this is the overall SDG index. So you can get a sense by shades of blue. The darkest blue are those with the highest score. And so the lighter the shade of blue, the lower the score. But that's just one aspect of it. You can, again, see maps for any of the SDGs specifically. So, for we have a lot of interest about education among us. So if you wanted to see how that looks, and again, the code is over here, showing who's on track to achieve, who has some challenges, significant challenges, and major challenges. And so you can see there, Zimbabwe is falling under the significant category. Are there any questions about any of this, or any other screens that you might like me to go back to? It's a wonderful thing for people who like visuals and who like playing around with computers and screens, but it can be a little daunting if that's not your style. But it's actually more intuitive than it might seem. Despite having very many parts and very many details, it can really offer some really fascinating insights if it's something that you might like to spend some time with. Any other questions or comments at this time?
There's no question, but it's interesting to hear how the country is going about the SDGs.
Joyce, I didn't hear you properly. Sorry.
I said I don't have a question, but it's interesting to hear how the country is going about on these SDGs.
Okay, so I'll return one more time to my slides then. And just to point again, and this will be circulated to you afterward, so that you can do some follow-up reading and learning and studying and reflecting. These were some key insights that came out of the consultation I was describing for the current year's People's SDG Scorecard that has not yet been published in written form, but we can watch a video of the preliminary conversation at this time. And some of the key conclusions that were presented in the preliminary results were that we often see in Zimbabwe that there are a lot of the right policies and programs are in place, but it seems that the funding to actually execute those policies and programs never seems to be in place. And so between lack of funding and lack of political will, lack of energy or motivation on the part of those in government, there's often an underwhelming or unsatisfying implementation of all of those very nice plans, very nice policies and programs, such that progress is ultimately not made toward the SDGs that the program is designed to support. Another important consultation conclusion was that while there are a great many materials available to help educate the public, to make them aware of the SDGs and to help them to participate in the implementation and monitoring process, those materials are not widely accessible. Some of them because they're not made available in enough local languages. Some of them are not made to be age appropriate for those who are less than fully adult. And some of them are not put in proper formats to be accessible to people with a wide range of ability. Another key observation from the community that came together for the scorecard was that they're seeing that there is space for civil society to participate in the government's VNR process, which I should note is not to be taken for granted. In very many countries, civil society is not wholeheartedly included in the government's process of creating its VNR. Very often, civil society is kind of operating entirely separate from the government review process, and the government is not interested, is not inviting the direct input of civil society into their own or their official VNR report. So that is actually happening in Zimbabwe. There was a consultant hired by the government who was meant to liaise between government and the civil society networks and to help see that the input of civil society at these consultations, at the scorecard process, to help see that input was included in the VNR that's submitted by the government itself. However, despite having this capacity for input in place, members of civil society concluded that, in fact, their space that they were offered was getting smaller, and that most of the monitoring and evaluation process was taken by the government, and they did not have access to it. It was not a transparent process. So they did get one small voice, but that voice is getting smaller, and most of the work and the reporting is really done behind closed doors. And as we saw in our little tour of the digital tool of the Zimbabwe country profile that we were just touring, it's important to note from that report that we see lack of sufficient data to report on SDGs 1 and 14, and that right now SDG 13 is actually considered to be achieved according to the official benchmarks and indicators that were agreed upon for that goal. So now I'm going to essentially move us toward a close of session 1 by just giving us a sense of where all of this information is leading us. And I hope it doesn't feel too funny to get this picture at the end, but it involved needing a basic understanding of the process that we're moving toward before I thought it would make sense to lay out what we're hoping to do together. So as you already know from the flyer and the program, our work together involves a series of 3 workshop sessions by video call, this being the first. And based on the answers that you all provided in your registration for this first call, the dates that seem to work the best for us for the 2nd and 3rd calls are the 2nd of July and the 20th of July. Those seem to fit much better for the group as a whole. So those are the dates we will go with. Those are the dates we will meet again. And between these sessions, we will all engage in some independent study and reflection on some of the materials that were being introduced today, so that we can move from a place of kind of being awash in the information and feeling maybe that it's flowing over us, but we're really going to get our hands in it and start to think critically about some of the content that's in some of these reports. And after we've taken some time for that study and reflection, what we'll be moving toward is actually creating a joint report, a joint reflection on our experiences and perspectives of Zimbabwe's progress toward the SDGs that are the focus for this year's HLPF. We'll also share reflection on the policies and practices that we would recommend to local or national Zimbabwean government to help accelerate progress toward these selected SDGs. And we will also reflect together on recommendations and intentions that we offer to ourselves, to our own community of Catholic sisters, brothers, priests, partners in mission, about how we can be more engaged in monitoring and evaluating the SDGs and take part in this effort that's already so rich and vibrant among the secular or perhaps some other faith-based NGOs who have been participating in these umbrella organizations and submitting reports, because we have a lot to offer. There's no question that sisters, brothers, priests, and partners are deeply involved in implementing the SDGs, and that they have been doing that since long before the SDGs existed, which makes you all tremendous experts on what works and what doesn't. And so what we're moving toward with this reflection is trying to leverage some of that insight to help use some of that experience and that history, the absolutely irreplaceable role of those who are living in community and who have a presence and a relationship with communities that are often left out of development conversations. These are the experiences and the insights that are so desperately needed when it comes to evaluating whether or not we're really achieving the SDGs for everyone, whether our progress is really inclusive. And so it's imperative that we ensure that the voices of the marginalized and the left behind and the excluded are included in the evaluation process. And so that means finding new ways and creative ways as a community that is largely a community of practitioners, but finding new ways to be involved in the monitoring and evaluation conversation so that we can help change some of those trajectories and undo some of that exclusion that we already see happening in the ways that the SDGs are being implemented now. And so specifically, the first step to this independent study and reflection will be to review the summaries of the government's VNR reports that were submitted in 2017 and 2021. And I assure you, those are actually very short. The 2021 summary was actually 2 pages, and I think it even had some large margins. So those should be fairly short reading. But if you are interested, if you want to get into more detail about what the government is saying about your particular area of expertise, I very much encourage you to don't be afraid by the length of either the 2017 report or what we now know is 144 pages for the current year report. I encourage you to just take a look at it, get a sense of how it's organized, which topics are getting a lot of coverage and which areas aren't getting any, perhaps, and really take a look at your area of expertise, your area of ministry, and begin to reflect on, again, these kind of three big questions of where do I see my experience aligning with this report? Where do I see my experience conflicting with it? And what's missing? What other insights or recommendations do I have that are just not represented here, but could really be helpful to bringing more communities into the benefit of SDG progress? And so in addition to doing that reading and reflection with the government VNR reports, we're also asked to review at least one of the civil society reports, and you can choose, you can take a look at them and see which one you're drawn to. I personally like to lean toward the newest because that's bound to be touching on the topics that are most mentioned at this year's HLPF. There'll be more the focus issues. So I personally encourage that one, but if you see more of interest in one of the older reports from civil society, they all have value in terms of this reflection process. So I have links to all of them in these slides, so you can shop around and see, which one of the VNR government reports you want to look at, which one of the civil society reports you want to look at, and then again undertake this kind of 3-part reflection for each of those. And when we gather again on July 2nd, the bulk of our time together will be devoted to sharing our reflections on these reports and really getting into some of the details about our own experiences and what we think we have to offer to this conversation and how we can help advance it and really accelerate progress on delivering these SDGs. And that is my final pause to ask if there are any questions or comments about that last section or anything that came before it that perhaps came to you a little bit later. You're all just excellent students. You've captured everything the first time around.
No, hi, Teresa. I just want to comment on something. How fascinating it is as you were presenting. I found it very fascinating how our government, our country has presented the report. And I was also fascinated on how they did not talk much about the issue of poverty. They haven't even started. There's no information available. And on the issue of quality education and reduced inequality, I think these were of interest to me to just know what is it that they have said about these three goals, because with COVID-19, this is something else. But I am also interested on knowing what they have talked about. I'll look at it later on the issues of health and well-being. I would really love to know what they have said. So thank you very much for your presentation. Thanks.
Yes, this is when we get into the juicy details of, you know, how how these conversations unfold and what areas is government really paying attention to. And there's a rhyme that gets thrown around sometimes about, you know, you measure what you treasure. So any place that you see missing data, you can kind of take it as an indicator that this is not a priority. This is not a top concern. And so where we see that, it's kind of, you know, what we call a red flag, something to be a little bit alarmed about, a little bit unsettled, especially in an area that's so important as the concept of poverty, which is of course present throughout the agenda. But a question in that first goal of basic income and the basic funds that people have to work with on a daily basis. Definitely an important thing to be, that we should be paying attention to in every country.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And I say that, but I'll add to it that it comes with no particular criticism from me, because I'm from the United States and we have not submitted a single report on any of the SDGs yet. So that's not coming from any kind of high horse from my own country's perspective. I would love to see us have anywhere near 200 or 144 page report. And I hope that will come someday soon.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments? All right.
Teresa, just to say, I put the link to this year's VNR in the chat box if people want to copy it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Veronica.
It's missing from one page where I went to first. So I don't know what day it went up. I noticed it's in one place and not another.
Okay.
So that's why I thought we should share it now in case we lose where I got it from.
Good. Yeah, I don't want to undo that work. It'd be very frustrating hours you could spend trying to find it again. Father Joaquin?
no, only wanted to give you thanks for the presentation. For me now is clear also what is expected. It was at the beginning, it was not very clear what it was expected from me, unless so from us. But now I think it's clear also. I think we started also with the workshops about the JCoR, no, but we didn't finish them. So I think this is clear what is the picture, no, and what is the work that is expected from us. Well, I think it's also a lot of stuff to read, and I feel, I don't know, very, very punctual, no, very humble in order to give suggestions. But I think it's coming, no, from the reality, and I value it from there. But yeah, the commitment also is big, but I think is clear. Also, to work with the other organizations, not that they are doing it in the ground, I think it's very important. Well, we don't have too much experience there. No? I suppose there are other organizations inside the church that they are doing something, but maybe we don't have awareness, no, of the reports that they are doing, or how are they submitting, or how are they giving. But thank you. I just wanted to share that. Now it's clear for me. Thank you very much.
Good, I'm glad. And if anyone has any comments about if I should rearrange the order of any of that, I'm open to feedback and criticism too. So it's always an open conversation. We have to do our own monitoring and evaluation here to keep things right. And just to follow on from Father Joaquin's comment, I just want to add that even whether you're Brian and you've been engaged in this in VNRs for a handful of different countries, or it's the first day you ever heard of a VNR, and the idea of a 144-page report sounds terrifying, you should know that the reason we have a presence as religious NGOs at the UN, and the reason that you're being invited to engage in this process is because you have very unique, valuable, important insights from your experiences in ministry. And it's those experiences that you already have, that's what you're being asked to bring forward to the conversation. It's not, we have to do some reading, yes, to be able to understand what others are saying, but in terms of what we hope that you will bring to the conversation, that comes from your ministry and your experience and the communities that you live and work alongside. And their voices and their experiences need to be part of the conversation. And you are very, very well equipped to bring that forward. And that's why you're here. So let there be no doubt that you have much to offer, and that the conversation needs you in it. And Father Pamidzai.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. It's so enlightening, and it's an eye-opener to see to it that there is more than just hearing. Sometimes you hear people talking about this and that, but as they say, experience is the greatest teacher that comes late in life. And for me, I really appreciate how far you've been working, and so far what you've presented, it brings at least a picture of what is really on the ground. But moreover, I think, as you have mentioned, that we in our ministries, wherever we are, we have like the first-hand experience, and we're able to be in touch with what is happening on the ground. So this has brought really a lot of challenge, that whatever we see and we experience in some observations, and be able to contribute, and also to have a voice that will help also to enlighten some other issues. And at the same time, because what is presented on paper seems as if it's not a true picture at times of what is happening and on the ground, because we've got different experiences, a vast experience, but it will be interesting also, as you've said, for the reports to hear what is happening, because my experience will be different from the other person's experience, but we share, and from that we can learn. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
Absolutely, thank you. And as we'll get to this in our next session together, but as we approach the forum itself, I'll also share, there'll be a kind of more solidified schedule by that time of what all of the events involved in the forum will be. And I know you all have probably 3 or 4 ministries that you're responsible for. So I know you won't be able to take a week and a half to just sit at your computer and watch all of the proceedings. But we will offer a list of events that might be of particular interest, including, of course, when the report is being delivered by the government of Zimbabwe. But the nice thing is, since everything's online, just about everything is also being recorded. So if there's something you desperately want to see and you're not available at the time, you can probably watch it later. So we'll try to get all of that kind of organized for you so you can make a plan and follow the things that are most interesting to you as the forum proceeds.
Thank you.
All right. So if there are no other comments, then I think I will close us again with just a final word of thanks to you all. Great to meet new partners and to reconnect with those who have already been collaborating with for over a year now. I'm excited to begin another leg of the journey with another team. And especially in the next section, I'm deeply looking forward to learning from all of you and your experiences and what you have to share with this conversation. So I'll be emailing you very soon so that you have all of these links to all of these exciting reports, and you can begin your shopping, look through the library and see what you want to devote some time and reflection to. And that is all for now. So thank you all so much, and enjoy the rest of your fairly late evening for the most of you on this call. And I will be in touch very soon.